Hey, this is Josh with Budget Mechanic. Today I want to walk you through the steps on replacing an alternator in a Toyota Tacoma. This is a 2015 and it's got the 4-cylinder. So the engine in this truck is actually the same from 2005 to 2015. So if you have a model anywhere in there, this will work. But also because it's a 4-cylinder and pretty accessible alternator, it's going to be a very similar process to a lot of 4-cylinder motors. I determined that the alternator was bad by testing the battery in the alternator. And I actually made a video on that, which I'll post the link to, for how to tell the difference of bad battery versus bad alternator. So if you get through this video and it's helpful to you at all, please drop us a comment, like the video, subscribe to our channel. It would really help us out. So I just wanted to show you where the alternator is on this engine. On the 4-cylinder, it's right up top here, pretty accessible, which will make it quite a bit easier to do. So the first thing you want to do with an alternator job is disconnect the battery so that when you're pulling the wires off the alternator, you're not getting a bunch of sparks and shorting out the wiring. You'll notice here that I'm charging the battery because the failing alternator has actually caused the battery to not be as strong. And ideally, you don't want to put a new alternator on an old half-full battery because it puts a lot of stress on both of them. So I always try to charge up the battery that was in the car with the failing alternator so that when the new alternator gets put in there, everything's good to go. So as always, we do the negative terminal. That's all we need to remove. We'll leave the positive on. And I'm going to reattach the charger so that while I'm working on the alternator, the battery is still charging, but it's disconnected from the system. So next step is going to be removing this belt because it goes around the alternator. And in order to do that, we need to take the pressure off the tensioner, which is this pulley down here. So this is the tensioner pulley right here, but there's this little fitting, a 14mm nut basically, that you're going to put a wrench on and crank it clockwise, and that's going to release the tension on the belt. So 14mm, put some pressure on it, and it's off. So now I can flop this belt off. I'm going to leave it on all the other pulleys. I'm just going to push it out of the way a little bit. That way I don't have to rethread the whole thing. I'm just going to do it for the alternator. Okay, so next thing I want to do is remove the positive wire and the trigger wires. So the way that works on this, it's got this little plastic cover over the nut. And what I'm going to do is just pry with a flathead screwdriver. I'm going to pry it out away. So that just flops up and reveals the nut underneath, 10mm. Remove that nut. And this is where, if you hadn't removed your negative terminal, if your wrench came in contact with anything metal on the car, you'd get a big short and lots of exciting sparks. Nut off, and then this wire will just lift off the post, which should make it easier to get to our trigger wire. Okay, so this tab you want to push down on the left side. Screwdriver is really good for that. Push it down all the way and then yank the plug out. So here's that little tab you got to push. Okay, I'm also going to just undo this little retaining clip. See how much room I can give myself with this wiring. Okay, so there's 2 mounting bolts on the alternator. One's up top here, and then one's all the way 180 degrees below it, right there. Both of them 14mm. I'm going to do the bottom one first. You can reference the new alternator just to look where the mounting bolts are positioned so that you don't accidentally loosen some of the other bolts that are kind of in the same vicinity. But let's do the bottom first. These can be really tight, so you definitely want to make sure that you're using like a 1/2-inch drive ratchet or something long. Okay, before I take that all the way out, I'm going to come and loosen the top one. Sometimes when you get them both loose, then you can get them both out by hand after that. Kind of jiggle the alternator around. There's the top. So this bolt is stiff all the way out, so I'm switching to the smaller ratchet so I can go faster. Here we go. He's a long guy. Okay, this is the fun bit. where you have to, basically you've got both bolts out, and now you gotta weasel it out of here. And they can be really tight fits, so sometimes you just have to work it back and forth while you lift. Jeez. All right. I'm gonna push this radiator hose back, and out she comes. So as always, before I get too carried away putting the new one in, I'm just gonna compare it to the old one to make sure the bolts are all in the same place. Make sure that the wire plugs are the same, and then just making sure there's no bits of hardware that you're meant to transfer over to the new one. Sometimes they have little vents or something that you've got to transfer over. You want to make sure that you do that before you install it. So just a quick tip, if you're having trouble putting the new alternator into the motor, just like I was struggling to pull the old one out, it was a really tight fit, it may be because the spacer that comes on the bottom of the alternator was already pushed in on the new one. You can see on my new one it's flush on the inside, whereas on the old one that I was pulling out, it had already been pressed in by the bolt and it's now sticking out. So sometimes I've even had to take a screwdriver and drive that spacer back out to create enough room to get the alternator onto the engine mount. Okay, so we're just going to sneak this thing back in there. On this engine, the upper radiator hose is my give point, so that's what I'm pushing. Okay. So now I'm doing the lineup of that mounting point that has to go between the two flanges on the alternator. Got it lined up. I'm just going to start the top bolt, just so it's hanging on it. Now that it's hanging on the top bolt, I don't have to hold it up anymore, and I can focus on lining up the bottom. So I just kind of maneuver the alternator around until I feel the threads catch, and I can start it. Yep. So right at the end, I'm going to use the big wrench just to make sure I get enough leverage to really cinch it down. Okay, time to put the wiring back. So I'm going to start with this harness clip. So that goes over the post. And the plastic cover. Harness back in its retainer. Okay, so it's time to put the belt back on. So I have left it mostly threaded around the pulleys, so now I'm just going to take the excess and get back on my tensioner bolt. I'm gonna push that way down. That will allow me to get this over the... You gotta compress the tensioner way more to get the belt on than you do to get it off. There we go. And I'm just going to make sure that in doing all that, I haven't flipped the belt off any of the other pulleys. Oh, I did here, see? Good thing I checked. And then make sure that this is back on the power steering. Easy. Last step, reconnect the battery. And I'm going to remove the charger because I think we're good to go on that. Okay, now that we are done putting the alternator back in, we're going to test it. And in order to test the alternator, we're going to use this voltmeter. If you don't want to buy a fancy one, you can usually get them for $15–20 online, just a cheapie. And if you really don't want to do that, most auto parts stores or mechanics will offer free battery and alternator testing. Okay, so we're going to switch it to DC, the lowest range of DC. So depending on how your meter's set up, it'll have different sections, but essentially you're going for the one with the line and the dots underneath. That's the direct current setting. And then you're going to take your black to negative and red to positive, and check the reading there. So a new alternator should be putting out probably 13.5 or more. So this one is looking good. All right, so now you know how to put the alternator in your Tacoma. Hope this was helpful. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you subscribe because there's more to come.